And we're about ready. 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1.
Greetings and salutations. I'm Dan Kastner. I am the Scientific Director Emeritus of the National Human Genome Research Institute, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome you to this, the 16th installment of the 21st year of Demystifying Medicine, a course that is set up specifically to bridge the exciting developments in biology and engineering with medicine, knowing that there is so much information in these various fields that it can't all fit into one head, and that we need to have conversations and collaborations amongst us in order to get that more complete understanding. Our sessions go from 4 until 6 o'clock in the afternoon, Eastern time, and I realize that some of you are on other time zones besides Eastern time, but for those of us in the East, between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, from January 4th until May 17th. It used to be May 3rd, but as some of you know, we have a session next week with Brigitte Wiedemann and Jack Sturm on neurofibromatosis, but then we have a 2-week hiatus, and then at the very end on May 17th, we have Francis Collins telling us where we are headed in biomedical research, a session that I'm sure you will all want to attend. In any case, you can tune in by clicking on that link there below, https://videocast.nih.gov. And the course schedule is listed right below that with our 2 sessions still upcoming. If you attend at least 50% of the sessions and you wish, and you pass a very, very easy final exam, you will receive a certificate for continuing medical education. You do need to know the CME number, which is listed here on this first slide. It is 38656. Again, that's 38656 for those who are not looking at the screen. You can submit questions during the presentations to the Send Live Feedback link on the videocast display. And all previous sessions are archived at the link shown on the slide. We will be getting that final exam up, by the way, by the end of next week. So please do look for it on the website. In any event, if you have any further questions, send an email to my partner in crime, Dr. Wynn Arias, who is the founder of this course and the person who thought up this wonderful idea of having the Demystifying Medicine course at the NIH. So if we can have the next slide, we have shown the iconic Brooklyn Bridge, which crosses the East River in New York. And of course, it was under construction in I think it was the 1860s through the early 1880s. This is a photograph which was actually taken by Dr. Arias's grandfather when the bridge was under construction. So it's going between Manhattan and Brooklyn, which at that time were separate cities, actually. And you can see on that catwalk on the left, those 2 guys standing there, and that probably is a basic scientist from Manhattan and a clinician from Brooklyn who are talking about some of the medical and scientific issues of the day. And that's what we intend to do this afternoon, is to focus in on some really interesting stuff that brings together biology and medicine. If we can have the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about this week's presenters. So the title of this week's session is How Minds and Brains Create Language. And our first speaker is going to be Dr. Evelina Fedorenko. She is the Frederick A. and Carol J. Middleton Career Development Associate Professor of Neuroscience in the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences at MIT. She's also a member of the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT. She received her bachelor's degree, magna cum laude, in linguistics and psychology at Harvard, and then did her PhD in cognitive science at MIT, and then did a postdoc at MIT with one of the coveted K99R00 grants. Her research group studies the relationship between language and other cognitive abilities and social perceptual abilities. She also studies the processing of linguistic signal in the brain, language processing in the brains of bi- and multilingual individuals, cross-linguistic aspects of neural infrastructure of language, and the emergence of language during development. Her group uses a number of sophisticated approaches, including functional MRI, to understand language processing in normal individuals, individuals with developmental brain disorders, and individuals with special aptitude for language. So she is going to be our first speaker. And then our second speaker, if we can have the next slide, is going to be Dr. Nadia Biasu. She is a staff clinician and diagnostic neuroradiologist in the Radiology and Imaging Sciences Department of the NIH Clinical Center. She is chief of the Integrative Neuroscience and Communications Unit at the National Institute for Deafness and Other Communications Disorders. She's also an adjunct professor of radiology at George Washington University, a core member of the Georgetown Division of Neuroradiology, and a senior fellow to the Linguistics Data Consortium at Penn. She received her bachelor's degree in English literature at Amherst College, a master's and PhD in applied linguistics and cognitive science at the University of Pennsylvania, and she received general diagnostic imaging training at Georgetown and subspecialty fellowship in neuroradiology at the University of Pennsylvania. Her work is in the interdisciplinary research spanning applied computational neuroscience, neuropsychology, applied linguistics, and biomedical imaging. She is a dedicated clinician educator. She mentors physicians in training at Georgetown and George Washington, and currently she is the director of the Department of Radiology's Clinical Neuroradiology Clerkship. So anyway, we have a spectacular lineup of speakers this afternoon, and I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Fedorenko. Ev, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Dan, for the kind introduction. Just give me 1 second. And is everything looking okay to you?
Wunderbar.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak in this course. It's a real honor and a great pleasure to be talking, followed by Nadia. So I'm excited to share with you some things that we've learned about the language system from the more basic science perspective. So I'm going to orient us a little bit first because language is quite a multifaceted cognitive ability. So when we understand language, linguistic input can come in through our ears when we're listening to somebody speak, or through our eyes when we're reading language, or actually when we're watching somebody sign, if we're talking about sign languages. Once it has been analyzed by the perceptual mechanisms, we interpret this input by linking it to our stored linguistic knowledge representations. And this is what's happening on the side of language comprehension. So we recognize familiar words and put them together into phrases and sentences. And on the side of production, generating utterances, we can use the very same knowledge representations to convert an abstract conceptual representation, our thought, into a sequence of words, which we can then send down to the motor system to either implement it in terms of a bunch of articulator movements like I'm doing right now when speaking, or we can also, if we're literate, we can write or type, or again, if we're speakers of sign language, we can sign the message. We now know that each of these components of the broader language system is supported by a separate set of mental computations that are implemented in different parts of the brain. What I mostly focus in my work and what I'll talk about today is this chunk of language that is in the red box here, what I often call kind of the high-level component of language processing. So it's just a little situation of this question and problem that I'll talk about. So I often start my talks with a quote by a famous vision scientist, David Marr, who wrote that to understand the relationship between behavior and brain, one has to begin by defining the function or the computational goal of a complete behavior. Only then can a neuroscientist determine how the brain achieves that goal. So this quote is kind of against the very so-called reductionist approaches, where some have argued that once we understand what each cell is doing, we suddenly will understand, language and consciousness and all sorts of other high-level functions. And he's saying, no, you need to also consider this overall goal for something to exist in terms of kind of evolutionary biological considerations. So what is the computational goal of language? Why did language emerge in our species? Language, which we can broadly define as basically a generative system of form-meaning mappings, emerged in our species quite some time ago, relatively recently in the evolutionary time scale. But why did it emerge? To what end? And for many components of biological organisms, the answers are, the functions are really clear. So we have eyes to see, lungs to breathe, legs to walk and run, and so on. But for language, this question has been a topic of fierce debates for decades and even centuries. Two ideas have been prominent. One, perhaps the more intuitive one, is that we have language in order to share thoughts with each other. And we can speculate on why that might be useful, with proposals ranging from facilitating cooperative behaviors like hunting, to passing on knowledge, like technical knowledge to our offspring, or socially relevant information like who to trust, and so on. An alternative idea, however, is that language evolved to enable us to think more complex thoughts. One of the most famous philosophers of language, Noam Chomsky, has been arguing for many years, and to this date, against this notion of language serving a communicative function. So here's a quote from a presentation just a couple of years ago, where he said, "Almost all of your use of language is internal. Virtually all of the use of language has nothing to do with communication. The idea that language has evolved as a system of communication or designed for communication makes no sense." Instead, he has always argued that language evolved to enable greater complexity in thought. So he writes, "The systems of thought use linguistic expressions for reasoning, interpretation, organizing action, and other mental acts." This idea has also been advocated by others, including famously Wittgenstein, who wrote, "The limits of my language mean the limits of my world," although later in his life he backed down from that position. But how would we know one way or another? Evolutionary questions are notoriously difficult, but certainly relying on simple philosophizing and intuitions doesn't seem like the right approach. And so today I want to tell you about two kinds of empirical data that I think inform this question of why we have language. First, I will examine the relationship between language and other aspects of cognition, including complex thought and reasoning. And second, I'm going to tell you about some properties of language, and we can see whether looking at those properties can shed light onto what the system may be useful for. And I'm going to argue against the idea that language evolved for thinking more complex thoughts, and for the idea of language as a primary tool for communication. So before I go into the evidence itself, let me introduce to you the system that I had put in the red box in my first slide. So the system that supports language processing in your brain. We have known for quite some time that there's a set of areas in our brain, in the left hemisphere in most individuals, that are important for language. And those regions are working really hard in all of your brains right now as you're understanding what I'm saying. Using brain imaging tools like functional MRI, we can find these regions in just a few minutes of scanning by, for example, contrasting brain responses when I have you read or listen to some sentences compared to processing stimuli that have perceptually similar features, but don't have meaning and structure. So for example, I can have you listen to speech in a language that you understand versus speech in some unfamiliar language, or reading sentences compared to just sequences of strings of letters that don't form words and don't combine in any way. And here's just a few sample individual maps of this system in 6 individuals from our database. For a contrast between language and the perceptual control. These maps are highly stable within individuals, so I can bring you into the lab today versus 10 years later. That's about as far, it's about the span of my career using neuroimaging tools. So we know that at least across that span of time, these activations are highly stable. But as you can probably even appreciate from just these 6 examples, they're somewhat variable in their precise locations across people. And this is the reason that I have been arguing ever since the beginning of my career trajectory for the importance of identifying these regions at the individual level, so as not to blur individual brains in a common space, which suffers from all sorts of shortcomings and sometimes leads you to incorrect conclusions. I will briefly mention, since Dan in his introduction mentioned polyglots, we and many other groups are trying to understand the nature of this variability. So you can see that it's not just where exactly these regions are, some other properties, like for example, how much these regions work when you're processing language, or here I'm showing you just the left hemispheres of these people, how much activity is happening in the right hemisphere, given that the language system typically shows some activity also in the right. And all of these features, again, are stable within people and variable across people. And we and others have been trying to ask, do these features relate to something like behavior? For example, does having a bigger language system make you better at language or worse? This is still very much work in progress, but just a little bit of a tidbit of a finding. We've recently explored brains of individuals with what you may call linguistic talent, although not all of them will describe themselves as such, but these are individuals who are polyglots or hyper-polyglots. So these are people who have some proficiency in 8 up to about 50 different languages. And what we found is that in these polyglots and hyperpolyglots, these language areas tend to be smaller and more focal. And again, this is stable within these people. If we scan them again, we find the same thing. So it appears, at least the way that we're interpreting these results, is that they don't need to use quite as much cortical real estate to process the same information efficiently. But I won't say more about this. So let me just tell you some basic properties of this language system. So these regions respond robustly when you understand language. And at the point when information gets to these areas, it doesn't matter whether you read it as, in a text, or if you heard it through your auditory system. In that sense, the system is amodal. Similarly, it also responds when you produce language. Like in my brain, these regions are working hard right now. And again, it doesn't matter whether ultimately you send this information to your articulators if you're speaking like I'm doing right now, or if you're going to write the message or type it up or something like that. And together, these 2 properties should suggest to you, they do to us, that the system plausibly stores linguistic knowledge representations, as I have alluded to. And of course, these representations can be used to both decode linguistic messages when we hear them from others, as well as encode our thoughts into linguistic formats. Topographically and functionally similar regions emerge across speakers of diverse languages. So we have been working hard to try to increase the linguistic diversity of language investigations, because most cognitive neuroscience work has been done on English, German, and Dutch, which are fine languages, but certainly not representative of many aspects of typological variability that characterizes the almost 7,000 languages spoken across the world and signed. And so we've now shown that across about 50 languages, across more than 10 language families, various properties of this system, like not just its basic location, but the extent of its lateralization, the extent to which it's specialized for language, seem to be stable across these diverse kinds of speakers. And now we're getting to the point where we can start asking questions about potential differences in the neural infrastructure as a function of different properties of these languages. Another important property of this system, as many other brain systems, as it turns out now, is that the regions of this network are very strongly functionally integrated. They have strong anatomical connections and a high degree of functional synchronization in activity, suggesting that they work together in the service of a common goal. And of course, something that kind of gave rise to the whole field of cognitive neuroscience, we know that if you damage these regions in adulthood, you're going to have problems. And Nadia is going to talk more about it. So you'll have problems in comprehension, production, or both. Now, I should say that if you damage even extensive parts of the left hemisphere in childhood, nothing bad happens. In fact, we've been working with an individual who grew up without her left temporal lobe, and she didn't know about this until she was about 25 years old. And presumably, of course, these differences are because young brains are both redundant and plastic, and I can talk more about it in the question period. So now I'll tell you about the first kind of evidence that I'm going to use to argue that language is primarily used as a communicative tool as opposed to a tool for thought. So let's examine the relationship between language and complex thought and reasoning. So I want to start by considering kind of the spectrum of abilities that humans have, which is quite a lot of things that we can do. Many of these things, of course, other animals can do. Some of them are specific to humans. So aside from our perceptual intelligence, which supports our ability to recognize objects, faces, and voices, and our motor intelligence, which supports our ability to physically act and interact with the world, we can do things like do numerical processing, like math. We can engage in logical reasoning. We can acquire completely evolutionary new skills like computer coding. We can create and appreciate music. We have a host of executive abilities like attention, working memory, and inhibitory control, as well as planning and decision making. And using these kinds of fluid intelligence abilities, we can solve novel problems on abstract stimuli. We can interact cooperatively with our conspecifics and jointly solve problems. We can figure out what somebody else is thinking, as well as resolve conflicts both locally and at the large societal scale. And of course, we also possess a very rich knowledge of the world, of the objects and their properties, of events and their typical orderings, of the physical constraints in the world, and of what kinds of things are possible in real world versus only in our imagination. So what is the relationship between our language system and all of these other abilities? Over the years, many have argued for overlap between language processing and almost any aspect of cognition and even perception, motor control that you can think of. But I will argue that language does not actually share resources with any of these abilities. And many of the early claims, I think, were based on suboptimal analytic approaches that have led people to incorrect conclusions. So I'm going to argue that language does not support any non-linguistic cognitive abilities. So here, okay, so first I should say to probe this relationship, to probe the relationship between any two cognitive abilities, two primary methods are used. Functional MRI is a good tool for that question. It's not good for many other questions, but for this question, it's actually the best tool we have, and patient investigations. So first I'll present you some fMRI evidence. So here I'm pulling data from across a bunch of experiments that we've run in the lab. This is 32 functional MRI experiments across several hundred participants. And we tested overlap between language processing and these diverse kinds of abilities. To do this, we found people's language regions in each brain individually. And then we had people do one or more non-linguistic tests. So we had them listen to a piece of music or solve some math problems or engage in some logical reasoning and so on. And so in dark and light gray, I'm showing you responses estimated to sentence comprehension, so understanding language. And the gray is our perceptual control condition. So these are conditions like backward speech or reading non-words or pseudo words like blorp and flicket, or which sound like language but are not meaningful and non-combinable. And in different colors, I'm going to show you. Zero here is just a fixation baseline, so lying in the scanner, fMRI scanner, without any stimuli. And in different colors, I'll show you responses to these different non-linguistic stimuli and tasks, which span a wide range of abilities, including those linked to complex reasoning. So I tried to group them here by kind of domains or categories. So we have visual, both social and non-social stimuli processing in yellow. Auditory conditions in orange, including different kinds of music conditions in light orange bars. Hand and face motor control in red. Numerical cognition, so solving math problems, in pink. Reading computer code in purple. Executive functions like inhibitory control or working memory tasks in blue. Object and event categorization conditions, so deciding if a picture of an animal shown in a picture is dangerous or not, for example, in teal. And visual event comprehension in green. So this is pictures and videos of meaningful events. And as you can see, these brain areas that work really hard when we're processing language work about as hard when you're solving a math problem or listening to a piece of music as they do when you're looking at a blank screen with no stimuli at all. If we draw a line from our control condition, the reading of non-words or listening to backward speech, we can see that the only conditions that elicit a response above it are some of these meaningful visual events, so pictures and videos of events. This response is still much lower than that elicited by sentences, and as I'll tell you in a second, patients with even severe language problems don't seem to have any issues with visual event semantics, suggesting that this response in the language system is not functionally critical. And it's important to know that all of these 64 conditions elicit very strong responses in other parts of the brain. It just happens to be in different areas than the ones that are activated by language. The complementary approach for addressing this question of whether language shares machinery with other mental functions is to examine cognitive abilities in individuals who lack a properly functioning language system. And most telling here are cases of global aphasia, which results from severe damage to the language system, typically as a result of a large stroke. So here are brains of 3 such patients. So basically, effectively, the whole parasylvian cortex is wiped out in them. And they have problems, severe problems in both comprehension and production. Sometimes understanding simple common words is spared, but that's the best case. And my colleague and collaborator, Rosemary Varley at UCL, has been studying this population for quite some time, testing them on a wide range of non-linguistic abilities. And over many years, including some work that we've done collaboratively, she's shown that in spite of these incredibly severe linguistic deficits, these patients can do math, they can solve logic problems, including play Sudoku or play chess, solve all sorts of novel problems, engage in working memory and cognitive control type tasks, appreciate music, and navigate complex social environments. And as I foreshadowed, they also seem to have an intact understanding of the world. So the only thing that they lack is the ability to convert their thoughts into a verbal format and to extract meaningful information from others' linguistic productions. And these findings align very well with the picture that I have painted using fMRI data. Here's a nice quote from an individual who was suffering from aphasia, illustrating this point. There's many, many quotes like that. This is just one particular one from a German philosopher in the 18th century, Johann Spalding, who developed aphasia as a result of stroke and expressed, presumably with great effort, the following notion. I saw and recognized everything around me in its true shape. I tried to speak to see if something coherent could be uttered, but no matter how much I forced attention and thoughts together, shapeless and entirely different words ensued rather than the ones I wanted. I therefore contented myself with the expectation that I would not be able to speak or write for the duration of my life, but that the principles and dispositions known by me would always remain the same. So to restate here, it appears that the language system does not share resources with a wide range of abilities, including pretty much any abilities we've tested so far. However, I'll mention briefly, I won't talk about this here in the interest of time, but in spite of this sharp separation, there is growing evidence for a deep link between the system that supports language and the system that supports social cognition. And this evidence comes from diverse sources, from linguistics and psycholinguistics, behavioral investigation to developmental work, to brain imaging investigations and human and non-human primate brains. And I can elaborate on this if there's questions at the end. A couple of things to keep in mind here. 2 non-implications of functional specialization in the brain. One is that specialization in no way entails innateness. Those are orthogonal dimensions, even though they're sometimes conflated in people's theorizing. But we have beautiful examples of emergent specialization, for example, in our visual cortex, where individuals who are literate have a region that is highly specialized for processing letters in the script familiar to them. And the way that I've been talking about the system as a store of linguistic knowledge actually kind of implies that I also think that this system emerges and becomes specialized in the course of our experience with language in the first few years of life. It also doesn't mean that the computations that are implemented in the language cortex, in this language specialized cortex, are fundamentally different from those that support processing in other domains. They're carried out separately in a separate piece of brain real estate, but I suspect that many of the same computations that have been invoked in other domains, from vision to motor control, where we have to retrieve representations from memory, We engage in predictive processing, trying to figure out what's going to happen next, integrating elements, simpler elements into more complex representations. I suspect those are all the very same ones that support language processing. Finally, I have here been talking about losing the language system in adults when everything is already in place and developed, and you take the language system away, as in cases of these globally aphasic individuals, and everything seems to be fine with the exception of linguistic ability. But could language be important for putting some of these abilities into place during development? Of course, it's very hard to answer this question. Methods are very limited, but we know a little bit about this from an interesting population of deaf kids who are born to hearing parents. So the majority of deaf kids are actually born to hearing families. And so typically there will not have been a reason for the parents to acquire a sign language. And so in many cases, such kids, they're loved and taken care of. So it's not like those cases of wild children or cases of horrible abuse, which is very difficult to interpret anything from because there's just so much other stuff going on. But in these cases, all that these kids are lacking, sometimes for quite a few years of their life, is exposure to language because they can't hear spoken language and nobody's signing to them. And it seems that strikingly, most reasoning abilities in these kids develop just fine, with the exception of some aspects of theory of mind reasoning. And this is part of one strand of evidence for a deep link between language and social cognition that I have alluded to. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears and look a little bit more deeply within the language system to see if some of the properties of linguistic representations and computations may give us some clues as to the function of language. I'm going to suggest to you that language has some properties that actually make it ill-suited for complex thought, and some properties which make it well-suited for communication. So first, why is this language system not good for complex thought? So complex thought typically involves relating different propositions to one another. So it naturally requires integrating information across quite extended time scales. Yet the language system appears to have a relatively short, what's now become known as a temporal receptive window. So if you may be unfamiliar with this concept, a temporal receptive window is basically a temporal analog of a spatial receptive field. So some of you may know that in the visual cortex, primary visual areas in the back of our head have very small receptive fields, so they pay attention to only a tiny fraction of the visual field. And as you move along the ventral stream, the size of the spatial fields increases. Similarly, different parts of our brain seem to vary in how much of the preceding context, what happened just before the time when you're processing the relevant stimulus, can affect the processing of that stimulus, okay? And with respect to language, it seems that the processing within this language system that I've been talking about, the specialized language system, is really only on the order of a few words, between 6 and 10 words. And beyond that, there is no sensitivity to information in the preceding context. And there's a couple of different sources of evidence for this, which I'm happy to discuss more. Now, of course, we have a system in our brain that keeps track of much longer time scales of information. A system known as the default network or default mode network appears to have quite long integration time windows, but this system is no longer specific. So it processes information in verbal stimuli like stories or dialogues, as well as completely nonverbal stimuli like, for example, silent films. And of course, the language system has to interface with this system. I suspect that this is one of its downstream targets, if you wish, but critically, the language system itself appears to only keep track of relatively short context, which I think make it not suitable for reasoning or thought. Another point is that in the theoretical tradition that has advocated this idea of language as a tool for thought view, the focus has been on syntactic rules and representations. And in the recent years, well, I guess it's the last like 20 years now, linguistic syntax has been reduced to the single combinatorial operation, which in this tradition is referred to as merge, which is basically construed as an operation that creates new representational elements Z from some already constructed elements X and Y. And the whole reasoning in this tradition is that this operation emerged in the human brain and enabled greater complexity in thought, allowed us to put together propositions into complex trains of thought. Now, for this whole argument to work, this combinatorial operation has to be highly abstract in that it doesn't care what the things are that it's combining. But it turns out that linguistic syntax is actually not abstract, and instead it's intimately tied to meanings of particular words being combined. I don't have time to talk to you about the specific evidence for this, but there's published papers that I'm citing here. I'm happy to point you to, but basically we and many others now have found that there's no such thing as a syntactic hub, a part of this language system that just processes structure but is not sensitive to word meanings. And even more critically, to the extent this whole system, of course, is sensitive to structure because that's a big part of regularity in the input. But any bit of that system, be it a brain region or a population of cells, which we can probe with intracranial recordings, anything that shows sensitivity to structure, like, for example, a stronger response to a connected sentence than a list of unconnected words, or sensitivity to grammatical violations, will also be deeply sensitive to meanings of individual words, so responding more to table than Blickett. I'm gonna skip over here a tiny little bit, and this general a strong integration between structure and meaning aligns with accumulating evidence against a general distinction between memory and computation, where it seems that the very same circuits that store information are also used to process that information. And these arguments come from both neurobiology, where no known organisms have cells that just store information versus just perform some kind of computation, as well as from what we've learned from computer science, where memory basically allows for efficient reuse of past computations through memorization. So instead of computing everything on the fly every time you encounter some relevant input, you can store whole sets of function calls, whole sequences of function calls. And that reuse is highly efficient and is now very actively being used in a lot of deep learning systems. All right, so so if language doesn't rely on an abstract combinatorial operation that can be applied to any kind of representations, combined with the fact that engaging in complex thought does not activate the language network, and with the fact that complex reasoning appears to be possible even when the language system is severely damaged, it's just not clear how language could have given rise to complex thought and reasoning. And now I'll briefly mention in the remaining few minutes, I'll briefly mention two properties of language that make it well suited for communication. So there is now ample evidence that natural languages are highly efficient for information transfer. This evidence comes from all levels of analysis in language, from sound system to vocabularies to grammars. All of which appear to be strongly shaped by communicative pressures, together leading to a linguistic code that is short on average, making it easy to produce. And on the other hand, contextually disambiguated and redundant, which makes it easy to understand and robust to noise, which characterizes many linguistic exchanges. And if language evolved for internal thought, it's not clear why it would exhibit these kinds of characteristics. Now you can, and some people have argued, well, maybe it evolved for thought, but then it acquired these characteristics along the way due to its secondary role in communication. But then the language for thought hypothesis basically becomes unfalsifiable and therefore I think scientifically not interesting. And the second property of language that also to me only makes sense in light of thinking of it as a communicative tool is that language processing appears to be fundamentally predictive. And prediction in language, as in other domains to me, only makes sense from the perspective of a comprehender who is trying to infer the intended meaning from some linguistic signal, and engaging in predictive processing makes this process easier by reducing the effort because expected elements are now pre-activated. And again, it's not clear why language processing mechanisms would become predictive if language was primarily an internal system of thought. And I have like 2 or 3 minutes left here, so I'll mention one, I think, very cool source of evidence for language mechanisms being predictive, which comes from recent efforts to relate deep learning architectures to human representations, neural representations during language processing. So you all know this, language has been long argued to be one of the most difficult domains to study because we don't have animal models, so we're very limited in the kind of things we can do. But one barrier, specifically the lack of computational explicit accounts of language understanding, has suddenly been lifted. And this just happened like literally over the last 5-6 years. With increases in computing power, massive language corpora available, and machine learning advances, real engineering breakthroughs happen in artificial intelligence, where now we have deep learning models, including famously so-called transformer architectures like GPT-2, which do really well on a lot of sophisticated language tasks. And the fact that all of these successful models are trained on next word prediction leads to suggest that this kind of training leads to representations that approximate meaning well enough to perform well on these tasks like question answering or generating free-form text or translating between languages. And presumably this is because in order to successfully predict the next word, you kind of need to learn to implicitly pay attention to all sorts of regularities in the signal. So what we did recently is try to see if models that are better at this computational objective of predicting the next word are also better at capturing something about human language processing in the brain. And so we took over 40 state-of-the-art language models and pitted them against 3 human neural data sets. By pitted, I just mean the most straightforward thing you can do, where you have some neural recordings from people processing language stimuli. You take those stimuli, you feed them to those different language models, and then you extract some set of unit weights from those models. Having that, you then train a linear regression from the unit weights to the neural units, whatever they are. We have both intracranial recordings and functional MRI. And that linear model can then be tested on some left out human neural data to see how well it can predict responses to unseen stimuli. And first of all, so this is a graph showing performance on of these 43 models on capturing something about human neural responses. And some of them already do really well. There's quite a lot of variance, which means that there's a lot of interesting things to explore, like why are some models better than others? But critically, there's a strong relationship, and I'm wrapping up, I promise, one minute, that models that do better on next word prediction, so here lower numbers on the x-axis mean being able to better predict the next word in this normative task that the models are trained and tested on, and how well they capture human neural responses, suggesting that maybe, I'm skipping over some things here, but the key message, don't worry about these graphs here, but this result to us suggests that maybe optimizing for predictive representations is a critical objective for both biological and in silico language networks. And in these graphs here, this is just a set of control analysis showing that performance on some other language tasks like, ask a model to make a grammaticality judgment or to judge how similar two sentences are in meaning. Performance on those tasks does not predict brain scores or how well a model matches the brain. So to go back to this question that I posed at the beginning, what is the primary function of language? Is it to think more complex thoughts or to share thoughts with others? I've shown you that the language system is strongly segregated from the rest of the brain and strongly specialized for language processing. Although I alluded to the body of evidence that's growing, suggesting that there is a deep connection between the language system and the social cognitive system. And I further show you that language has some properties that make it not well suited for complex thought, and some properties, including predictive coding, that make it well suited for communication. And I think both of these lines of evidence support the communicative function of language and suggest that the idea that language evolved for more complexity in thought is unlikely. And I'm gonna stop here and thank you to all my funding agents and collaborators. Thank you.
Well, Ev, thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. And it certainly does make us think back a few tens of thousands of years with regard to how all of these things evolved. And certainly, I'm sure we will have some really interesting questions to ponder at the end. But before we start pondering those questions using language as our tool, at least to talk about it. We have our second speaker who is going to regale us with another aspect of this topic. Nadia, take it away.
Let's see if I can. All right. Do you see? Thank you, Dr. Kastner. Do you see my slides?
I do indeed, and I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Evelina, I want to thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk. It reminded me a lot of the times when I was in graduate school, and really is one of the reasons why I went to medical school after getting the PhD. And it's this issue of minds and brains and how they create language that was really the impetus for why I went to medical school. When I was in graduate school, there was a great deal of to do about mind and brain. And you know, the reason I was actually interested in language and speech is really because it really touches on nearly every aspect of our interactions with each other and also with the medical spectrum. We see it in autism. It's one of the prodromal presentations of children who have autism. We see that in you mentioned in your talk, patients who have strokes, who present with language deficits. We also see that in neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's disease. We see it in normal aging. There are specific changes that occur as someone ages, which are different from what we see in neurodegenerative diseases, such as in multiple sclerosis, in Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, and even subcortical dementia, and even in neuropsychiatric disorders, as we see in patients who have mania, who have auditory hallucinations, and in patients, you know, such as in patients with schizophrenia. And so my real reason for being interested in this and wanting to go to medical school was because I wanted to be able to make sure that I could make an impact to improve, preserve, or restore that ability to communicate in patients who have these types of diseases. And when I was in graduate school, the main issue about mind versus brain was really a fundamental one. And you mentioned Noam Chomsky. I happened to have gone to a school that was very influenced, at least at the time when I was there, I was very influenced about the work of Noam Chomsky, which was basically on generative linguistics. It was really kind of theoretical linguistics. And the question was, are we really interested in the human mind? Are we interested in language because we're interested in the organization of the human mind? Or are we interested in the human brain? And at the time, it was really, we are interested in the human mind. And the structure of the languages, of human languages in general, was a reflection of the organization of the mind and not that of the brain. And they often used the analogy of a computer to make this distinction. We're interested in the software, the programming of the computer. We really don't need to know about the ones and the zeros of the hardware for us to understand how the software works. And so it was really, we were really interested in the human mind. But that's true, and that can be true, but it depends on what you want to do. And given that what I wanted to do was to not only be able to diagnose, but to maybe even intervene, to improve the ability and preserve the ability of human beings to interact in a meaningful social way with each other, understanding how this came about in the human brain, or where, what was the underlying networks and structures and how this came about was fundamental for me. And that's actually one of the reasons why I ended up going to medical school after finishing a lot of the graduate work. So as I mentioned, this was a fundamental issue. And at the time, there were many people who felt that the brain really had nothing to say about the structure of the human mind. And I'm going to present some experiments, some of my own experiments, some other experiments performed by other colleagues that tells us that the two are actually complementary, and that one sets up the theoretical basis upon which one can perform your experiments, but the biology must constrain that theory in order for one to make sense of it, especially given what it was that I wanted to do. As Evelina presented, she talked about global aphasia, but there are many, many different types of aphasia. Anomic aphasia, conduction aphasia, transcortical aphasia, Wernicke's, Broca's. In medical school, we often talk about two main types: Broca's on the one hand, Wernicke's on the other. Broca's being an activation that's found mostly within the inferior left frontal cortex, and that patients who have damage to that area often speak in a very effortful type of speech. And the second is Wernicke's area, where the activity, the damage is actually located more posteriorly, and patients they present with very fluent type speech, but speech that doesn't really make that much sense, full of words that are made up, known as neologisms. But as you can see, there are really not just two main types of aphasia. There are many, many types of aphasia, and these have been very well studied in the aphasic community. I shouldn't say aphasic community, but people who study aphasia in the aphasiology community, in which these have been very, very well documented and categorized, and so on and so forth. One of the things, though, is that we talk often about language as being predominantly a cortical phenomenon. And this has pretty much been documented in all of these different types of aphasia. And we still talk about that. We still talk about language as largely a cortical phenomenon. But there are also subcortical phenomena, subcortical aphasias as well. Patients with Parkinson's disease not only present with a kind of dysarthric, effortful type of speech, but also with difficulties in understanding certain types of aspects of language. So there is a contribution of the subcortex, which I don't want to leave out, but it's something that I do take into consideration when we are talking about the kind of networks that subserve language. So I just mentioned this to say that we are not only talking about cortical phenomena, but there are also subcortical contributions to language, which I will not focus on, but I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind. So let's talk a little bit about Broca's area. And the reason why is because, as I mentioned, in medical school, we talk about these two main areas: Broca's, which is really about speech planning, it is said, and patients who have damage there kind of present with a type of agrammatic, effortful, telegraphic type of speech. And then we have other patients with kind of fluent, neologistic type of area. But really, what does Broca's area do? And I'm going to try to convince you that it's not just about effort. And the way in which I'm going to do that is really to look at the performance of some patients who have damage in this area and who were asked to repeat certain types of words. Now, we have used we've used specific types of languages to try to take advantage of of aspects of the language in order to show the underlying phenomenon. And this experiment happened to be French-speaking patients, because there were we wanted to look at the pronunciation of certain types of words. As I mentioned, patients who have Broca's aphasia tend to have lots of difficulty in producing certain types of words. Not just they have difficulty with all types of words, but particularly some types of words over other types of words. And if it's really true that Broca's area is really about the effort or the articulation of speech, why should patients who have damage in that area have more difficulty producing some type of words over other type of words? That doesn't make sense. So we actually had patients who were French-speaking patients repeat certain types of words that were very similar in the structure of these words. So we have words like liquide, which is liquid, and lequel, of which. So these words, some of them present as content words, we call like liquid a content word, and others that seem to be much more grammatical in their origin and their function. And we simply had them repeat the words. And we found that these patients had far more difficulties. They made many more types of errors, many types of phonological mistakes, and were actually much more difficult. It was much more difficult for them to articulate these words that seemed to have these grammatical functions to them, even though the words were nearly identical in terms of the phonological makeup of them. So there's something a little bit different about the grammatical words than the content words. And in addition, when we asked them to say the words in sentences, the percentage of errors tripled even. So there's something a little unusual, and we can't simply say that Broca's area is just about speech planning and articulation. So what is it that we're able to find? So there was initially a hypothesis that said that there were two classes of words, and that these words were actually processed in very different ways, and it was called the dual theory of word processing. And we found that there was probably enough evidence to suggest that at least in the brain, these two types of words were processed via different mechanisms, because they could be damaged differently with different degrees of effort. There are some investigations that really looked at neuroreceptors in these areas, because sometimes when we looked at the cytoarchitectonics, and this work was done at the Max Planck Institute, the cytoarchitectonic of these brain regions in terms of Broca's area and other areas of the brain really you're not able to really differentiate one level of cortex to the next. So what defines Broca's area? And so they actually did a neuroreceptor study and found that there were similarities in M1 muscarinic receptors that were located within Broca's area, as well as in anterior cingulate and basal ganglia. Broca's area, anterior cingulate, and within the basal ganglia. And we know that anterior cingulate and basal ganglia are involved in attentional aspects of word processing. And so we thought that, well, if this is true, then perhaps this might be an explanation for why it is that patients would have even more difficulty when they had to articulate the words within sentences, as opposed to when they had to articulate these sentences in isolation. So because there was something else at the sentential level that was a problem for them. We initially would think that because at the sentential level we could use probabilistic predictive types of models to try to predict what would be the next word, but it didn't quite, those models wouldn't really explain why it is. And perhaps Evelina can share with me some of her ideas on that, why it would be that at the sentence level, these words, although they had difficulties in isolation, actually have even more difficulties at the sentential level when there are more tools that could be brought to bear to solve some of the predictive areas, some of the predictive phenomena. So we thought that since we know that areas of the brain, the anterior cingulate, basal ganglia, and some of these neuroreceptors that are found in those areas are also found within the Broca's area, that perhaps there is an attentive component that is also involved, and those areas are actually not available to these patients to be able to articulate this when these words that they're already having difficulty with in isolation are asked to then be put within the sentential structure. And so what we did to test that was that we asked normal healthy individuals to listen to some words that have been manipulated acoustically, such that we are making those words a little bit more difficult to have to process. And if you ask patients to or subjects to listen to these kinds of words passively, we really don't see activation of Broca's area nor the thalamus. But when we ask them to make a decision on these subtly manipulated acoustic phenomena, now we see activation within Broca's area, we see it within the anterior cingulate, and we see it within the thalamus. So we think that there's a component of attention that subserves your ability to process some of these data, and that the Broca's area is activated and recruited to subserve some of those, to provide some of that additional resource for you to be able to make those kinds of decisions. And in the patients with Broca's aphasia, that area is damaged and therefore unable to recruit those additional resources that are required for you to pronounce these letters, these words, when increased resources are required, such as in sentence comprehension, even though one would expect that using predictive models would actually help subjects to have decreased areas of decreased errors, pronunciation errors, than we actually see. This is actually what we do see in subjects, normal individual subjects who are asked to listen to natural language. It is thought that because of the predictive ability of the language structure, these patients, when you're listening to natural speech, really don't recruit areas of Broca's area. It's only when the broadband is actually narrowed and it becomes much more effortful that we see that kind of activation. And that's what we would have predicted would have been the case for the Broca's aphasics, that using natural language and predictive models would have helped them to produce these words with less difficulty. But we found that that was actually not the case, that it's the opposite. And we think that there has to be in areas and in conditions of increased cortical demand or resource demand, they are unable to recruit that attentional resource to be able to produce that, and therefore the performance decreases. So, as I mentioned before, when I was in graduate school, universal principles about mind and brain was such that it was said that the brain really had nothing to say about the structure of the human mind, but we actually are finding that by looking at some patient data, that the brain can reveal to us that the mind must be structured in particular ways. And so it can actually constrain some of the theories that we have to think about in understanding the relationship between the mind and the brain, and language and brain. So as I mentioned, the theory is really a framework of investigation, but must be constrained by the biology, and that at least for these patients, damage to a particular part of the brain can tell us something about how the lexicon is organized, and that it has to at least, it doesn't treat all words exactly the same way, that they have to have some sort of grammatical tag, it seems, and that these tags, when they're going to be placed within a sentence, require the recruitment of cortical and subcortical attentional networks in order to be able to process larger information. Often we say we see in the literature many diagrams that show activation of posterior superior temporal lobe, Broca's area, middle temporal gyrus, and premotor cortex. But I want to remind you again, and this is what I mentioned before, that its language phenomena is not simply a cortical phenomenon, but also recruits deeper subcortical phenomena, and we have to take those phenomena into account when trying to come to explain the kind of language phenomena that we want. And we will be using in this new lab that has recently been created at NIDCD, computational approaches, which Evelina also mentioned, to really talk about an integrated understanding of not only cortical areas of the brain, but how they are intimately involved with these subcortical areas and other areas of on the right side of the brain, because it does seem that the network is a bilateral network and quite interconnected, as she mentioned. And these kinds of networks are really needed to try to understand linguistic behavior, and for us to understand and predict what we expect should happen when patients are going to undergo particular types of phenomena, and how we need to intervene using these kinds of computational models to shorten recovery for these patients. It is really a fundamental collaboration between theory and experimental data, theory and biology, and it's interdisciplinary in its nature, involving both cognitive science, linguistics, psychology, neuroscience, computer science, and data science, and neuroscience and neuroimaging. I want to thank a great deal of people who are involved in making this kind of research and possible. And many of the people who trained me are linguists and neuropsychologists and physicians by training, neurophysiologists as well. And we need, of course, graduate students who are well-versed in computer science and data sciences to be able to help to do all of this, this kind of work. So that's really what I wanted to share with you. It's really a new lab. We are going to be doing this kind of work going forward. And I'd love to have a chance to have any discussions with you about what we have discussed and hear your comments.
Wonderful, Dr. Biasu. That was really fantastic. And perhaps if you can leave your camera on and your microphone on, and Dr. Fedorenko can turn on her camera too, which she has now done, anticipating, predicting my next words. So in any case, we'll go to the Q&A. And at least getting started, we have a contrarian who is about to articulate his question first. So this person is asking the question, if language evolved to merely communicate, why did it become so complex? Conversely, there's a constructed language called Tokipona. I don't know anything about this, but Tokipona, with only 120 words. That is, apparently one can communicate at a basic level with only 120 words. Does language complexity and the lack of certain words or ideas in certain language support Chomsky's theory? So I think that that's a question for Ev.
Sure, happy to take it. I mean, I think there's quite a few distinct ideas that are packed into this question. So I want to first clarify something. So it is certainly the case that language will reflect the underlying complexity of thought. We see this even between individuals, right? We can make all sorts of inferences about how smart somebody is by the way they talk and by what they say. What I'm arguing against is this, I think, flawed inference where people think, well, look at us, we're humans, we're so smart. Also, we have language, therefore we're smart because we have language, which just does not logically follow. It could well be the case, and some people have argued for this, and I'm arguing for this view currently, that we got more smart, which we certainly did with the expansion of the association cortex and massive expansion, as well as some subcortical structures. And then we had more things to say, and we're highly social creatures. So of course our communication system is going to catch up to it, right? People say, well, why don't, bonobos, why don't chimps develop language? I think the communication system they have is perfectly fine for what they're trying to communicate to each other. It serves the purpose, the niche that they have, the complexity of interactions that they have. We have a lot more to say, and so we develop, words for more concepts and so on and so forth. I'm not sure, so I'm not familiar with this particular, I'm not sure how the argument from Tokipona works. So there's a bunch of conlangs, right? Esperanto is perhaps the most famous one, but the ones that have been invented in the context of science fiction, like Klingon or Dothraki or High Valyrian, those are interesting. They're interesting phenomena. I don't know exactly what they can teach us about natural language. I mean, so we can certainly construct new communication systems. We're very flexible beings, but I'm not sure how that kind of evidence can argue for or against the notion of language evolving for thought or not. If the person would like to clarify the reasoning steps there, I'm happy to engage, but it's just not obvious to me. But so the last bit, I guess, in that question is, does language complexity and the lack of certain words or ideas in certain languages support Chomsky's theory? I think it's really orthogonal. We know that languages come up with words that are useful to them. So many of the world's languages don't have words for exact numbers. They have words like, a few and more, but they don't have words for one or two. Piraha is such a language spoken by an Amazonian tribe. And they don't need this because they don't farm. One common idea for why number of words come into a language is when you start having to enumerate similar entities. And so, yeah, it seems somewhat independent from this argument, but I'm happy for the person to follow up if they would like. And I'm sorry if I misunderstood some claims in there.
All right, well, maybe we'll go on since we have quite a long list of questions here. And actually, you raised an interesting point with regard to non-human primates, and you were discussing bonobos. And I was just curious, or at least one of the questioners was curious, as to whether any work has been done in terms of functional MRI or any other kinds of sophisticated studies looking at non-human primates in terms of seeing whether or not certain areas of the brain that in humans are involved in language, are they also lighting up in bonobos or chimpanzees or whatever?
There is such work. I mean, there is a lot of earlier work on brain anatomy, establishing all sorts of homologies, both in terms of cortical areas and in terms of the tracts that exist in a earlier form in our primate relatives. And in more recent work, there are studies with both macaques as well as the social monkey, whose name the highly social monkey species that, marmosets, sorry. When you have a kid, a lot of your brain power goes out the window. Anyway, and a very cool set of findings is emerging from that work, which when I first saw these areas that emerge when basically monkeys are observing others' communicative signals, the topography is eerily resembling the human language system. And I think there's a lot of interesting hypotheses, specific hypotheses to test in that space. So one idea that I'm hoping we can evaluate with some developmental data, like in the next 10, 20 years, those questions are hard, is that perhaps evolutionarily and maybe developmentally, we start out with a bunch of cortical tissue in the association cortex that is attuned to conspecifics. We're very useless as babies, more so, like extremely so for humans, but even other primates are quite helpless. And so we need to pay attention to conspecifics to survive. So one possibility is that we have some social attuned cortex that initially will respond to all sorts of features like voices, faces, like any kind of socially relevant information. And then as we get more and more sophisticated and we learn about all of these different kinds of social signals, including at some point a bunch of communicative signals that we can store as, symbolic mappings between forms and meanings, there emerges this kind of mosaic segregation among nearby areas and from this common area into these distinct sub areas. And you can test this. If this is recapitulated in human development, you can test this. So there should be basically, this change in increasing specificity for particular aspects of social agents that we observe. But for now, it's a hypothesis.
Evelina, can I just follow up? I guess one of the things that I have always been, that was mentioned, when I was graduating, is that the language that humans, not that the communication is unique. We know that many animal species have communication systems, but that the way in which human language is used by humans to express, to have combinations of sounds to express a thought that has never been heard before is something that's unique. Have you found that is not unique, and that other animal species have that?
Well, it's again, so you're talking about complexity in thought largely, right? And we certainly know that compositionality is not uniquely present in humans. If you ever watch Caledonian crows do sophisticated tasks where they get morsels of food out of bottles, there's a lot of complicated action planning. So I think at this point, it's really crazy to say that humans are the only ones who can combine representations into more complex representations. What I think has been leading the field for many years in not quite a productive direction is discounting the importance of storage in the brain and a search for specialized circuits, specialized brain regions. And there's a long history in the science of humanity to want to be special, to want to be qualitatively, categorically different from other animals, from Copernicus, who got a lot of crap for his discovery, right? All the way to people who really want to discover this region that doesn't exist in animals. And the evidence for that is just not there. To the extent that there's some machinery, some regions that don't have clear homologs, they're not in the language cortex at all. They're frontal polar regions.
Yes.
That's like the best evidence that exists. For everything else, there's homologies. Why people are so obsessed with postulating categorical distinctions, I don't know. I like animals. I think they're great. I think we're a sophisticated kind of animal, but just animals as well. And an interesting thing about storage is people always say, well, I can teach my dog some words, and that's true. I can, and I have too. And you can teach parrots words, but you can't teach them to combine things in new ways and whatever. And it's true, you can teach them words, but you can't teach them 10,000 words, which a 3-year-old, 4-year-old will know. And this is orders of magnitude kind of a difference. And people kind of just like set it aside. And storage is hugely important because the more information you can store about the world, the more easily you can make abstractions, generalizations, find connections between things that are otherwise just not apparent if you're storing everything, storing a small number of elements. And so I think some of the properties of combinatorics in language and perhaps some aspects of reasoning are actually falling out of this greater ability to store information and to form abstractions. And I have a paper with Steve Piantadosi, who worked out a bunch of math. I just kind of helped think about these issues for how that could happen, just through kind of back on the envelope mathematical proofs, not like any empirical evidence. But I just think we should not discount the importance of having a bigger brain.
So the two of you have now opened Pandora's box, and since you're talking now about the animal kingdom, I think that we're ready for the next question, which is, have dogs and cats been scanned in functional MRIs? You know, when one mentions to the dog or the cat their name, you know, does that light up something in their brain, and is it in some sort of analogous area in the dog or cat brain to the human brain?
I don't know. There's a little bit of work. I mean, it's a growing like dognition, right? Dog cognition is a growing area.
Well, I know they have definitely used cats to be able to understand the role of thalamus in modulating cortical activity in the auditory cortex. Whether that's associated to language entities like the cat's name and so on and so forth, I don't know. But we do use other animals to understand what is happening within the human brain in terms of activity, frequency modulation, for example, in the auditory cortex and its effect, and understanding feedback mechanisms and feedback loops from the thalamus to the cortex and back to the thalamus. So yes, we do look at, the field in general does look at many different types of animals to try to answer those kinds of questions, and then use the non-invasive imaging techniques that we have to confirm that in humans.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of Pandora, another question that has come up has to do with and maybe this is just a misunderstanding of some of the things that the two of you have presented, is that a lot of these images of the brain show like certain areas of the cortex that light up, or in some cases, Nadia showed some lighting up of areas in the thalamus or basal ganglia or what have you. Are there any ways of imaging like networks, or tracks, or something that involves multiple components working together in some sort of a synergistic way? Yes,
there is a whole field of looking at network neuroscience, where we're really looking at the connectivity of these areas and not just particular areas of cortical activation. And in fact, the lab that we've just recently started really is focused on that. I did not show that to you because we still have a lot of data that we're analyzing, but we are actually interested in the interconnectivity of these areas and looking at how those connectivities change as a function of injury, as a function of surgery, and we have been able to, at least preliminary data shows that it's not just a reworking of just a local network. We do have that, but we have also changes in wide network changes, even on the other side, the contralateral side of the brain. So yes, I think the field is moving in that direction, looking at connectivity really as a way to better understand these kinds of behavioral metrics. And I think that they are also looking at multimodal imaging to try to understand many aspects of the behavior.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now Ev raised the question of sort of capacity being a major component of this, that maybe it's that one has to have a certain scale in order to sort of make the quantum jump from just a few scattered words or grunts or whatever to a language. So there was an article online a few days ago which the questioner did not read, just read the headline and not the article. Always a dangerous thing to do. But in any case, the question had to do with brain organoids and whether brain organoids could develop consciousness. Now, this may be a purely speculative or philosophic question, but this is an interesting discussion. And do either of you have any thoughts with regard to that question?
Ev, I'll let you take that.
I don't generally think too much about organoids, but there's certainly a lot of discussion along these lines about artificial intelligence, right? So as these language models are getting smarter, and this is actually another very interesting place where language and thought get conflated. And I'll explain why, right? So normally when we hear linguistic input, it comes from a thinking brain, right? But suddenly we have these networks that produce coherent text, right? Sometimes you can't even tell, at least for a little while, whether a human generated it or a machine generated it, And so then people start attributing to these models something that goes well beyond their linguistic capacity.
Yes.
But how can these models get there? They can't. They just have a bunch of corpora thrown on them. And of course, there are some regularities about the world that get reflected in the language statistics. And so it may appear that like they had acquired some deep knowledge, but they don't know what a table is. How can they? There are these disembodied sets of units, right, that talk to each other and learn linguistic regularities. And some people have said that that's a big problem. But I actually don't think it depends on what your goals are, I suppose. But if my goal is to have a implemented system that's computationally precise in all sorts of ways and probable, for me, that's actually really great, because I think these models serve as very good models of the system that I study, which is not a system of thought. It's a system that learns words and learns how their combinations approximate some meaning that then can later be, some reasoning can be performed by downstream systems. And so to me, actually, that way that these models are trained makes them really good candidate computational explicit hypothesis for how some aspects of language might be carried out in humans. And I was rushing through it at the end of my talk, but work from a few groups, including ours, has now found that even though these models weren't built at all as models of the mind or the brain, they were just built for the purpose of solving tasks in natural language processing, right? Like having Siri talk to you better than it does now, right? Like these kinds of things. And yet it seems that something about the way that these models are trained or something about the objective function makes them provide a reasonably good fit to the neural representations that we get from human brains as they process language. And a similar thing has happened in vision. In fact, work in vision has driven us to try this for language. And I think it's incredibly exciting. And I would not have predicted even just a few years ago that we would be able to get beyond these descriptive hypotheses, like putting little blobs on the brain and say like syntax happens here or lexical access happens here. Now we have actual models that we could play with, their architectures, their training, their objective functions, and try to figure out what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for a model to have so that it provides a good fit to the human brain.
But this gets back to the issue of minds and brains. Are we talking about the organization of the human mind, or are we talking about the brain? And even though the mind comes from the brain, yes, but when we are looking at AI and Sophia, for example, who, the sophisticated robot that's really able to mimic extremely well what humans do, it depends on what you want to use the data for. If what you want is to then be able to intervene to shorten recovery time, even the most sophisticated AI, I think machine learning models, still will not be able to give you what you want in terms of understanding that overlay of how it's actually being done within the brain. I think one really does have to look in the brain to really understand what those models are, and that the brain data will constrain what those AI and machine learning algorithms will do. It depends on what it is that you want. If you wanted to just kind of mimic and simulate what we're doing, then yes, we don't need to understand at all what happens in the brain to be able to do what these robots are able to do. And as you said, Evelina, none of these algorithms were ever created or generated to explain what happens in the human brain. But the outward behavior is remarkably similar to what we do. But it's really talking more about that, an organization of the mind understanding rather than how it actually is instantiated in the brain. And if what you want to do is to intervene in that brain, then you do need to understand how it is really, those nodes and networks have to have a meaning in space and time within the brain.
Okay, so now we have someone that's going in a little bit different direction. So we're going to leave the dogs and cats behind for a moment, and that's a relief, I know. And instead, there's the question whether or not there are, in a way, I guess this does go along that same line of thinking. Are there specific genes related to specific language components, such as FOXP2?
Oh. Well, I mean, I can briefly say so. So, I mean, Simon Fisher, the discoverer of FOXP2, back when he was, I guess, a graduate student in Monaco's lab, has spent, ever since he discovered, he spent the rest of his career explaining to people that is not a language gene. We should not expect genes to carve out cognition into boxes. There's not enough genes to have a specific gene for different cognitive functions. Genetic effects on cognition and behavior are extraordinarily complex. A prime example where this complexity has been studied recently is in autism research, where numerous genes have been implicated. Some genes have substantial effects. The rare like substantial mutations can have big effects. In most cases, it's a whole bunch of genes. Each of them has a tiny effect. And so trying to make sense of that complexity has proven really complicated, and kind of the only reliable links to behavior have been through measures of IQ, which is one very stable behavioral marker that we have in our disposal. But in general, no, there's no such things as genes for language, genes for speech. That said, it's certainly the case that certain speech and language developmental disorders run in families, from dyslexia to childhood apraxia of speech to stuttering and things like that. But again, it's not going to be the case that this gene only controls this aspect of speech and or language, and or this gene, only this gene contributes to these effects. It's a much more complex interplay. And for those interested, I would highly recommend Simon Fisher has a number of what he calls tutorials on Twitter, where he kind of goes through the basic misunderstanding of fundamental molecular biology by people who have made pronouncements about these genes being genes for language and things like that.
Your comment that there aren't enough genes in the human genome to account for all of the things that we'd have to account for in cognition and thought and so forth sort of harkens back to comments that were made back in the 1970s, which turned out to be true, that there weren't enough genes in the human genome to explain all of the immunoglobulin molecules that we have. And of course, the problem was that it wasn't recognized at that time that immunoglobulin genes could rearrange and somatically mutate and so forth. And it's just that there's a system that is basically based on those genes, but it's not based on the idea that each gene has a specific function in the system or whatever. So it's an interesting question, though, and certainly an important one just in terms of how we think about the whole process. So then here's one. Now we're getting into the polyglots. And there's the question of whether polyglots can also remember names and numbers.
It's a very heterogeneous population. I mean, like I said, so to my knowledge, there's only like 2 or 3 groups in the world who work with this population. They're very hard to recruit and find. And I think it's a real mistake to call them, to refer to them as a group. I mean, we've been studying them as such, but and coming into this, I was expecting a lot more homogeneity, having just been kind of traumatized by working on individuals with autism who are so diverse. I thought, oh, now I'll work with this nice homogeneous group. And it's just not at all like that. They learn language very differently. Some are hugely social and they're like go to markets and strike up conversations with strangers, which to me is like, I'm like a real introvert. So I would always learn languages from books. I used to speak multiple languages. It's all dead now, having lived in the US for a bunch of years. But some of them, they're good at different ways. Some of them, like there's a Washington Post article on this guy who is a carpet cleaner in Washington who speaks like 50 languages to varying capacities. He's incredibly good at imitating. Like you can say something to him in a totally unfamiliar language and he'll just veridically reproduce the sound form. It's incredible. It's really, really striking. But some people have pretty heavy accents and they just are really good at remembering words. And some of them are really good at picking up grammatical regularities. So I think that population deserves a lot more study, but it's really hard. It's, you know, so some kind of international efforts would have to be put together to try to get enough of these individuals studied so that we can make some conclusions that apply to the population as a whole.
And it sounds like from what you're saying that we don't even really have a good idea as to how many of them there are out there, because it's not like these people necessarily advertise the fact
That's right.
that they can do that.
Yeah. And some of them are real loners, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay, so another question about the polyglots, and I think that probably from your answer to the previous question, I can predict the words that you will use to answer this question. And so the question has to do with certain stereotypes of polyglots in terms of perhaps that there are more of them that are autistic or
left-handed male.
Yeah. So you would poo-poo that idea, I take it.
I would. I mean, look, of course, there's going to be more male polyglots. Women have historically been stuck, you know, in front of stoves, cooking and stuff. They don't have time to read books, right? Like, okay, a male bias, woohoo, you know, like, I don't know. I think until we have more rigor in studying this population, I just would be very cautious about drawing any such conclusions. Certainly from the kind of data we have, I wouldn't say that.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that. All right, so now we have it's just like the questions are flooding in. So we'll see if we can
saying things that are controversial.
our heads above water here. So here's a question. Can Dr. Biasu comment on the emerging evidence of bilingualism or multilingualism offering some protection against dementia?
Well, this kind of goes along the same lines. Number one, the patients, the dementia patients, which dementia are we talking about? Are we talking about Alzheimer's and frontal temporal dementia, vascular dementia, so on and so forth? And each one of those groups in and of themselves are highly heterogeneous in terms of looking at early, moderate, and severe disease. And bilingualism in and of itself also is a heterogeneous group. What degree of bilingualism? When did you learn the language? How balanced is your understanding? Can you speak, write, and read with equal proficiency? So there's a tremendous amount of variability in all of those, in each of these groups. So you'd have to have a fairly large study. I don't know that one has really done that, although there are some people who are looking at bilingualism and trying to answer that, at least in normal individuals. But I don't know that one has really been able to examine dementia in that particular way.
Okay. All right. Ev, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Well, I was just going to say that the general claim that bilingualism trains up your domain general cognitive control system is highly controversial. And there's now multiple large-scale studies with thousands of people failing to replicate the original claims. And just a plug for a junior researcher, Esti Blanco Elorieta, who is now at Harvard as a postdoc. She's done some beautiful work showing that a lot of the early claims about finding responses in domain general cognitive control areas are all due to basically task demands. So you construct these very artificial paradigms, like I'll show you this clue, say the word in French, I'll show you this clue, say the word in English, and things like that. And if you make paradigms much more kind of ecologically valid, like I'll show you a native speaker of French, like you kind of know these people, whatever, pretend or something like that. And you kind of naturally adapt to seeing, like I know, for example, that Dan speaks German and that Nadia speaks Italian. And when I see Dan's face, I'm going to use my German. And when I talk to Nadia, I'm going to use Italian, for example, right? If you make paradigms much more naturalistic, a lot of these activations in the cognitive control areas disappear, which is not to say that, no claims there hold water, but that literature generally is it's a very complex empirical landscape.
And there's even the issue of people code switching in bilingualism too. Like they may start a thought in one language and then switch and say the rest of the thought in another language. And so there are, as Evelina has described, there are just so many aspects of bilingualism that one needs to control for to be able to answer this kind of question. I don't think one has really done all of those kinds of controls at this time.
Now speaking of bilingualism and multilingualism, here the questioner is asking for advice. And perhaps you will want to dispense advice and perhaps you won't, but you'll have your opportunity. Do you have any advice for those of us who are not polyglots or multilingual on how best to learn a new language?
Oh, I don't know what to say.
Be young, be younger, learn them as a child. Like, it's maybe too late for you, but if you want your kids to speak another language, teach them early. Like there's something, well, that's actually also still debated about whether something is fundamentally different about our brains when we're acquiring our first language or our first languages in cases of bilingualism, multilingualism, or if just the exposure is fundamentally different, right? Like even with any immersion program you can imagine, you just never quite get this experience that infants have, where anytime they're awake, there's a face right in front of their face talking at them, right? That's just not the experience you have as a second language learner. And so beyond trying to learn languages earlier in life, I don't know if there's more wisdom, but I like, one thing to say is like, don't be if you want to learn languages, you can. Like people have learned languages in adulthood quite well. So don't, if you start learning a language and it's hard, it's hard. Don't be dismayed by, some people are good at it and I'm just bad at it. Just put in the time, right? It's like a lot of things you just get better with time and practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that language immersion is one way to force yourself to have to do that.
Yeah. Are there any imaging studies showing changes in the structure of the brain, say between a young child? I mean, presumably there's some changes, but changes that could possibly account for differences in language acquisition very early in life versus later on in life.
Well, there's a great deal of difference in terms of myelination patterns in young children. That I don't know that is the reason why, but we know that that's very different, the myelination pattern and speed of information processing when you're younger versus when you're older. So that may be one thing, but I don't know that for sure. Now, there was very early on a hypothesis that when you learned a second language, there was a question of whether it was superimposed on the primary language or whether it was kind of represented in a different area of the brain. I don't know that, and some people even argued that the structure of the brain changed as a function of learning a different language. I don't know that they have done imaging studies on that, but that was one thing that was that was talked about early on, in part because when patients had strokes, some patients may have lost the ability to do certain tasks in one language, but it was still preserved in the original language or in the other language that they knew. So at one point there was talk about that. I don't know that they did. I know that they did behavioral studies. Don't know that they did imaging studies on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, but it's interesting that a vascular lesion in a particular distribution would have such a specific effect that it could knock out your ability to speak German but not English or something.
Yeah, but not English. Yes.
Wow. Well, that's interesting. Well, now here we have a very long question, which I will read to you. So thank you for a very interesting talk. To me, the strongest evidence for a causal link between language complexity influencing thought comes from theory of mind, where our primary language is, or language or languages, really shapes the way we place ourselves in the world. In several First Nations languages, for instance, there are many more group pronouns, and these societies tend to be much more community-oriented and less individualistic. You mentioned this in passing in your slides, but can you elaborate on how language interfaces with theory of mind and through that cognition?
I think that's for you, Livy.
Sure, yeah.
It's a free-for-all for whoever wants to.
Yeah, so again, there's a couple different ideas that are packed into this question. So one is to emphasize, in case this wasn't clear, because I know it was kind of a pretty fast-paced talk, is that in the adult brains, the language system and the system that supports theory of mind or social reasoning are distinct. They activate distinct brain circuits, and I can take away your language system, for example, in cases like a large stroke, and you can still reason very well about other people's minds and intentions and things like that. That said, as I alluded to, in these cases where kids grow up without linguistic input, like deaf kids born to hearing parents, where they're not getting anybody signing to them, one aspect that is later developing is kind of the most sophisticated aspects of theory of mind. So thinking what Dan thinks that Nadia thinks, things like, especially like second order reasoning, right, about theory of mind. The nature of that connection is not clear yet. There are some studies that even causally show that if you train kids on verbs of mental state attribution, like believe and think and things like that, or even constructions, like these embedded clause constructions, like Dan said that X, right? That's not even an attribution of mental states. It's just a similar construction to Dan thinks that, right? It's that frame. Kids tend to pass theory of mind tasks better. So there's definitely some very intriguing link there. Its nature is debated, and I think there's a lot of cool work to do there. I'll mention that, so the second part of the question really mostly has to do with kind of effects of language on thought. And, this relates back a little bit to what I was talking about, Piraha not having words for numbers. Communication systems will adapt to the needs of the society. So if you have a need to talk about something, you'll come up with words and labels for those things. If you don't have those needs, you won't. There are sometimes stronger claims that having certain words in the language make you perceive the world differently. Like, for example, a claim has been made with color words, like Russian has 2 different words for blue. Dark blue and light blue are different lexical items. And there's some claims that this affects your color perception. Those claims don't seem to be empirically robust. Those findings that have been reported at some point, they don't replicate. So it seems that you can find effects of language on thought in cases where, if having a verbal label will help you do some task in the context of a lab experiment, of course you'll do it. We're very good at solving problems, right? And if we have that way to encode that information, some distinction, we will. But in terms of like fundamental effects of thinking about the world differently or perceiving certain distinctions better, it's a lot less clear.
So that the distinctions between different kinds of snowflakes that supposedly Eskimos have, with multiple different words for different kinds of snowflakes, wet snow, dry snow, whatever.
Yeah.
You can imagine that, but perhaps it's harder to think about how different words for different feelings or motivations or things like that, maybe that that's.
I mean, even with the words for snow, it's just, I think there's something funny sometimes in the reasoning direction. It's not like having those words makes you better able to discriminate different snow. Like you're in the environment where there's a lot of fine-grained distinctions among different kinds of snow and whatever. And so you come up with labels for it because it's fun to talk about, right? Like it's useful to make those distinctions linguistically when you communicate. So that direction just seems to make much more logical sense to me. And I think the evidence kind of goes along with that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and presumably things like emotional states and things like that are much harder to compare between individuals and to verify what each person is talking about, you know, between each other.
That's right. Yeah, I'll also, can I put a plug for another cool paper for from a group by Yunxiao B that recently showed that people's knowledge of abstract concepts is actually much more variable. Like what you think justice is and what I think justice is a lot less similar than what, you know, you think table is and what I think table is. And this can be shown with both brain imaging approaches and just asking people for similarities between words. There's a cool study called Idiosyncratic Tower of Babel, came out in Psychological Science just last year, very fun paper.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's an interesting thought. And going back to your comment about Ludwig Wittgenstein, at least the later Wittgenstein, you know, had this idea of the beetle in the box, and is your beetle in your box the same as my beetle in my box? And you know, it's an interesting thing to think about for a moment, anyway.
Although although the patients, even though that's true, the patients with Broca's aphasia do still have more difficulty in general with words that are considered content words, regardless of whether those content words are abstract or highly visual, which is, I think, kind of an interesting phenomenon. You know, we probably need to look a little bit more into that to try to understand why that's the case. And this is actually true regardless of language structure. So even though you have languages, the Indo-European languages, where the grammatical items are kind of separate from the content words, but even in languages like Arabic and Hebrew, where the grammatical items are embedded in the words, you still find that they have many more substitution errors as opposed to just dropping them out, but substitution errors on the items that are considered kind of grammatical versus those that represent more content orientation. So very interesting phenomenon.
Okay, so here's another question from the group. Ev Fedorenko's comments on storage echo what is happening in AI and machine learning. What separates the successes of AI machine learning today from the poor performances of old is not new algorithms, but more storage, more data, and more processing speed to deal with increased data storage. Maybe that's somewhat of a comment rather than a question, but any additional things to say about that?
No, I agree. I mean, yeah. I mean, availability of large corpora have also helped a huge amount. So suddenly we have corpora with billions of words, and so of course you can train on much more, just vaster amount of language.
Evelina, do you think that the AI architectures that we have now are representative of what the human brain does? Do we take in billions and billions of lexical items to learn something, or does the human brain tend to learn things using maybe a different types of architecture that has input, much lesser input of items?
Well, there's no question that human babies learn language differently in all sorts of ways, not just in the amount of input, but in the kind of input as well, right? They're learning at the same time about the world and about the mappings, and they learn from much fewer exposures and so on.
Yes.
So, I mean, I think it's a little bit, it's undeniably the case that using computational vision models and language models from the NLP field, they seem to have something that captures neural responses in primate brains, and actually even like mouse brains, as well as a recent paper on vision in mice. So something about them is similar. Now, I think we're not going to get very far if we're going to take one model and say, oh, look, this model captures, this amount of variance in my data. What I think you want to do in this approach that has been advocated locally in my department by Jim DiCarlo's group is this, what they call integrative benchmarking. So you take a whole bunch of models, you take a whole bunch of data sets, and then you're trying to look for trends.
Yeah.
Probably none of these models are right. Almost certainly none of them are the right models.
That's
but
right.
Some of them are better than others. And we can try to leverage this knowledge and the growing suite of tools that we have for probing these models, the representations they have, the kinds of features that matter for their performance, to try to gain some insights into how humans might be doing it through seeing which of these aspects of the models match to the human brain, or what we call brain scores.
Yeah.
But there's also a whole line of work trying to use like unsupervised learning algorithms, develop more human-like learning algorithms to see how those models do, and that's also an exciting direction.
Yeah.
Okay, now here's one that's turning the clock back 100,000 years or something like that. So how does quote unquote mechanism fit into this discussion about language evolution? The questioner says that they've read that Neanderthal might not have had language, not because they weren't smart, quote unquote, but rather that they didn't have the sophisticated vocal tract, yet they could draw. So do you have any comments on that? So the question is about that you would have a sophisticated vocal tract, and that makes part of the difference in terms of whether humans can speak or not.
Nadia, do you want to? I mean, I was going to, whether Neanderthals have had language or not is quite debated. So we should not just say that they didn't. So we don't know if they did. And there are certainly some people who argue that they did. But in general, that was one of the ideas for why other animals don't have language, because their vocal tracts are different and they can produce the richness of sounds. Like that is almost certainly not true. So people like researchers like Tecumseh Fitch have spent a lot of time trying to build in vocal apparati that would have some of the properties that allow production of human-like sounds, and that's not enough. So it seems like the differences are in the brain, not in some low-level machinery, right? Like, and again, for Neanderthals, and similarly for individuals like human individuals who are deaf, we can use our hands, right? We can develop full-blown languages using a manual modality. So it's very unlikely that something, and in fact, many stories about language origins favor the idea of gestural origins as opposed to vocal origins. So I think there's no strong evidence as of right now to argue that it's something fundamentally about like the production machinery that has given us language.
Okay, so it's now 5:56:56. So we've got, whatever, 3 minutes left. And so I'm going to ask just the very last question here, which is there truly a connection between language and climate? I didn't know there was one in the first place. Vowel-based languages in tropical regions, such as Hawaii, and hard consonants languages, such as Polish or Russian. If so, what might that reveal?
I mean, yeah, I think that's a very exciting line of work. Nadia, and please jump in.
Go ahead.
So people like Caleb Everett, Dan Everett's son, has been at the forefront of this work, and a few others. It's in some sense, it's not totally unexpected, right? Of course, our environments will shape all sorts of things about our behaviors, and so it's not at all crazy that if certain kinds of sounds are better transmitted in certain environments, that languages will optimize the use of those sounds. We're very efficient creatures. We find ways to solve problems, like I was saying, in all sorts of ways. And so the fact that some of these environmental factors are reflected in the structure of the language's sound systems, that makes sense. I don't want to trivialize those findings, because that often happens in science. When somebody establishes something, they're like, well, of course. And now a lot of people are saying, of course, language is separate from thought. But up until 10 years ago, people were arguing for quite a different view. But anyway, so I don't want to trivialize those findings. But yeah, I think they're fascinating. And I think there's a lot of very exciting stuff to still do there to try to understand what aspects of the climate or other aspects of the environment might affect the structure of languages, sound systems. And it's a cool research program.
All right, well, we're down to our last minute. And Dr. Arias wants to interject. Please, Win.
So what do we understand about how a newborn child grows up in a family where 3 or 4 languages are the primary languages of the family? How does the brain segregate those languages one from the other? And what are your thoughts about that?
I mean, well, humans and infants, including in infancy, they're very sophisticated statistical learners, right? And if you have different languages going on, they have different statistical properties. And it's often not just about the signal itself, but who it comes from. Like your mom may always be speaking in Chinese and your dad is speaking in English. And we pay attention to those things, right? I mean, you know, from Jenny Saffron's seminal findings, we've known that humans are very good at paying attention to all sorts of regularities in their environments. And so, yeah, it doesn't seem like they run into problems acquiring multiple languages in parallel, and they don't get confused. So it goes back to be young. If you want to learn multiple languages, it certainly seems like it's easier. But.
All right, so I guess that the next session perhaps, or maybe next year, we can start thinking about time machines and other things that we can use to advance ourselves. Well, anyway, this has really been great fun, and I thank the both of you, Ev and Nadia, for really incredibly wonderful talks and a really stimulating discussion this afternoon. We could go on for, I think, another hour if we had the time, but all good things do come to an end. And so we thank you both again from the bottoms of our hearts for taking the time with us this afternoon, and stay safe and be well. And who knows, we may be calling you back sometime in the future for a reprise of this wonderful session.
It was really fun. Thank you all, and thanks for your questions.
Thank you very much. Evelina, thank you.
Thank you, Nadia.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dan.
Bye-bye.
Hello.
Recording stopped.
Hi.
That was great.
Oh, it was fun. It was really great fun.
Yeah, really.
Lots of things to think about, that's for sure.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was just telling Kenny that mention tacos, my brain goes crazy.
Do we have any idea how many listeners we had?
Yeah, it was, I think we peaked at about 200.
Good.
179. I think there's going to be some more added on towards the end.
Wonderful. Good job, Dan. That was great.
Well, it was a lot of fun. They were the substrate for all this, that's for sure. It was easy when you have good talks and good questions coming in, that's for sure.
Okay, we may not be truly disconnected, by the way. So I see OD.
Or TLC needs to go away. Bye,
Well,
TLC.
I have to go away. So.
Oh, no. I want to say thanks, Dr. Kastner, and congratulations on your prize that you won.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Did you have a good time?
Well, it's actually coming up. I'm leaving on Friday.